All right. Here we go. As usual, very, very good questions. One question was far and away the most popular. That. What is an ideal marriage for Christianity? So I want to take a little bit of time with my answer. Let me jump over here to one verse out of the Bible that has a lot of meaning in answering this question. It's going to play if the sound is on. Oh, the sound may not be turned up. That may not be its fault. Or maybe it just isn't going to play.
その時、人とその妻は二人とも裸であったが、恥ずかしいとは思わなかった。
So that was short, but it's the first part of the answer. When the first man and the first woman were created, they were both naked and completely unashamed. And the first thing that happened after they disobeyed God for the first time, they became aware that they were naked, and they hid, and they covered themselves with leaves. Now, what this means as far as marriage and as far as Christianity, before there was disobedience, nothing was hidden. Nothing was kept private, because nothing needed to be hidden. When you marry someone, Christianity teaches, two things happen. First, you and they live so close together that you know a lot about them that nobody else knows. Second, you interact with them so often that you make lots and lots of choices about whether to be loving or whether to not do the loving thing. So the first part of the answer, what is an ideal marriage in Christianity? To be loved but not known is not satisfying. If someone loves you, really loves you, but they don't know you, there's always that worry that if they really, really knew you, they would stop loving you. On the other hand, if someone knows you, really knows you, and doesn't love you, that for most of us is our worst fear come true. Someone knows everything, including the things you keep private, and they don't love you. They reject you. The ideal Christian marriage is to be known completely and loved completely. That is what the ideal marriage that human beings would have a hard time achieving, that's what it would look like. That's part one of my answer. Part two of my answer goes a little bit like this. Marriage is a calling, and it is a calling that is not for everybody. Jesus never married, never had children. Of his apostles, the one who wrote most of what appears in the Bible is the Apostle Paul. And as far as we know, he never married. And he wrote about how people who never marry have a calling from God. Now, if you think about when the Bible was written, this idea that it was okay to not get married was crazy. The founder of every other major world religion got married. Buddha married and had a child. Muhammad married twice, I believe. but Jesus never, ever married. And there are some implications from that. In the ancient world, marrying for romance, marrying because you loved someone, was stupid. Nobody did it. In 2023, marrying without love, marrying even though you don't love them, strikes a lot of people as absolutely wrong, that you shouldn't do it. The Christian view is that God has promised us at the end of the world, when God judges his creation and welcomes home everyone who has accepted his gift and become part of his family, at that time, all relationships will be healed. There will be forgiveness. There will be openness. There will not be shame. People will be perfectly known and perfectly loved. Which brings us to the answer to this question. What's the Christian ideal in marriage? To live as though you are already living in a perfectly healed relationship. To learn what the Bible and the Christian faith teaches about a healed relationship and to live that way, where you and the person you're married to know one another completely and love one another completely. And as we said last week, you partner with God in growing your husband into who God wants your husband to be. Your husband partners with God in growing you into who God wants you to be. Long answer, but it was a popular question and a good question. Okay, second question. Which do most people prefer, instrumental or expressive? That splits by gender. Men and women answer differently. But the split is a little strange and a little bit confusing. We know from studies of gender in interpersonal communication that when men communicate instrumentally. We talk to get something done. Women very commonly communicate expressively. Women will talk with one another for the enjoyment of talking. But then, in interpersonal communication, we also study the communication that surrounds sex between adults, sometimes married adults, sometimes unmarried adults. And then what I just said reverses. Because men, when they initiate sexual encounters, they will do it based on appreciation, based on pleasure, based on aesthetics, which is why men are more likely to be sexually attracted based on someone's appearance. Women, very commonly throughout the world, are sexually attracted to a situation, not just to an appearance. They experience sexual attraction when someone shows kindness and support and consideration. They find people more sexually attractive if they have the qualities that they would be a good co-parent. It's sometimes in the social science literature called the nesting instinct. If a woman has a sexual encounter and a child comes out of that encounter, does the woman believe she will be left alone to take care of that child, or that this partner would stay with her and be good in that role? If the partner seems to be good in that role, the partner will be more attractive. Now that's instrumental. And the cues that tend usually to elicit sexual attraction in men have nothing to do with that. So to sum up my answer, instrumental and expressive, men prefer one, women prefer the other. But the interesting thing is, ordinary conversation, men prefer instrumental. Sexual negotiation, women prefer instrumental. Okay, third question. That was not supposed to be on there twice. Why are the forms of marriage in Japan so different from those in other countries? The answer to that is they're not. What we've described about expressive marriage is more common. You remember several weeks ago we talked about weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. The W, Western. In Western countries, marriages tend to be expressive. In the whole world outside of the West, South America, Africa, Asia, the majority of the world, marriage is still instrumental. So Japan is not by itself, while the rest of the world is the other way. Japan is not in the same pattern as a lot of the West. That, I would say, is because traditions are changing more slowly. And that has some complicated reasons behind it. All right, fourth question. Which is the most stable marriage from the viewpoint of contract, commitment, and covenant? I would say, first of all, contract is very definitely the least stable. And usually, the people in a marriage, if they view it as a contract, they know it's the least stable. I'm staying in this marriage as long as it is good for me. And if it stops being good for me, I will leave. That's just not stable. A commitment perspective marriage, both of the partners intend to stay to do the work, even if it gets bad. They verbally commit to each other that they will stay in the marriage. As far as the research question of stability, last week I talked with you about what Professor Strom calls a covenant perspective on marriage. But married couples with that perspective don't necessarily identify that way. They don't say, we have a covenant marriage. So there's not really any research that documents how stable covenant marriages are. But here's what does show up in the research. Active, involved Christians are a little bit more likely to stay married than other married couples in the West. The divorce rate for people who are not Christian is about 40%. The divorce rate for active, involved Christians is about 35%. So it's not a matter of Christians never get divorced. But it is enough of a difference that we would call it statistically significant. A 5% difference is good enough to get a study published. So there is a difference. Fifth question. Why do egalitarian people in egalitarian marriages, have less communication than others? This refers to the Taniguchi study from last week. So I went back to the Taniguchi study to try to find from the discussion the answer to this question. She said, the people in all marriages, including egalitarian, had some very Japanese values. In their home, they wanted to maintain harmony. They wanted to respect privacy, and they wanted to avoid confrontation. But the data also showed, commonly in egalitarian marriages, couples, the wife in the couple tended to be frustrated and disappointed from repeated experiences where it did not feel as though the work in the house was split fairly. In traditional marriages, wives felt that their husband was emotionally strong and stable. And what that implies is in egalitarian marriages, the wives were a little more concerned they would upset their husband. If the husband felt being equal in the marriage meant also being open with emotions, then the wife may have been less willing to talk about issues for fear of upsetting the husband. In traditional marriages, the wife thought the husband was not likely to show emotion no matter what, because men with very traditional views of masculinity, Japanese traditional views of masculinity, are a lot less likely to get emotional. One other wrinkle, one other detail, when I went back and looked at the study, Taniguchi said, even the women who were in a traditional marriage or reported that someday they would be in a traditional marriage, even they said they wished that it would be more equal. They wished that their husband would do more of the work. But if they believe that their marriage is traditional, their dissatisfaction, their frustration is lower. They appear to have just accepted. This is how marriage works. All right, next question. Why would God test his faithfulness by telling the innocent Hosea to forgive his wife? That's something that's been asked as a question a few other times in this class. My answer is, it is a Christian teaching that you forgive. You forgive anything, no matter how awful. And there have been some questions that have said, well, why would you do that? People don't deserve to be forgiven. And so my quick explanation here is, it's a Christian teaching that the quality of your love is what will dictate how far you will go in forgiving. Some of you someday may have a child who gets old enough to learn to walk. And when that child is walking and they're clumsy, they may step on you. And because I am a guy, the younger family members, my nieces and nephews, they've occasionally stepped somewhere and it really hurt. But they're little, they're children, they didn't mean to. And because they are little, they didn't mean it, and they're learning, I forgive them. As they grow older, someday you might be the parent of a teenager. And a teenager commonly is smart enough to know that there's something they can say that will really hurt you. They get to the point where they don't want you to have all the power. They have a drive to feel a little powerful themselves. They don't yet have the wisdom to know they shouldn't say that hurtful thing. But if you love your daughter or son who does that, then even if they say that horribly hurtful thing, you forgive them because they are learning and because they are still your child. So Christianity teaches the example set for us that God forgave us and offered us forgiveness for anything we did, no matter how bad. It is not hinted at or implied. It's explicit in the Bible. What he expects us to do is to forgive anything. So go back to Hosea. His wife was a prostitute. She was unfaithful. He had to go find her and buy her while she was being sold as a slave. He forgave because that's the example God set for him. All right. Next question. Traditional marriage increases women's conversations, and egalitarian marriage decreases women's conversation. But what about men? The Taniguchi study reported there was not a difference between traditional men and men in egalitarian marriages. Women's reported results polarized. Men's did not. Apparently, the men who participated did not talk very much about their feelings. Do Christians have to get married to other Christians? Nowhere in the Bible is that commanded. Nowhere. It's not required. It is taught. The Bible does teach that for a Christian to marry someone who's not a Christian is not wise, and there will be a lot of trouble. And a question that really made me curious, and I went looking. There is a big gender gap in Japan. Is it because Japanese people are not Christians? My first instinct was to say it's not as simple as that. And as a matter of fact, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, by their measure, the worst gender gap in the world is South Korea. And South Korea has a sizable Christian population. But I kept looking. The World Economic Forum has a measure of the gender gap in pay and other resources that's kind of detailed, and they update it a lot. So I went and looked at the July 2022 gender gap report, because the 23 one hasn't been published yet. They applied their measure of gender inequality to all 147 member nations of the UN. And I want to show you the top 20 and the bottom 20 and point a few things out. Here in order are the top 20 nations by equality. Iceland has the smallest gender gap in pay and by a lot of other measures. Iceland is 76% Christian. Every country on this list is historically majority Christian. I went down the list for a while looking for a country that was not. Out of 147, I got to the 49th, Singapore, which between Buddhists and no religion edges over 50%. The 48 above it were all historically, predominantly Christian. Now here's the bottom 20. And I will admit, of these nations, I don't know how visible that is, but Benin and Malawi are both Christian. As a matter of fact, Malawi is, I believe, 80% Christian. But other than that, 18 of the bottom 20, historically, predominantly not Christian. Now, correlation is not the same as cause and effect, but sometimes it is so striking that you think something is going on. So, is it a contributing factor that Japan has the gender gap that it does because it's not Christian? I could turn that statement around and say, if Japan were Christian, I think it might be higher up on the gender equality list. In case you're curious, the United States was number 27 out of 147. Japan was number 116. One other detail I will share with you. A lot of Christians don't notice this one little passage in the Bible, but it's just 3 verses long.
第8章。その後、イエスは町や村を巡って神の国を説き、福音を述べ伝えられた。12人もお供をした。また、悪霊や病気を治してもらった女たち、すなわち7つの悪霊を追い出してもらったマグダラの女と呼ばれるマリア、ヘロデの執事クーザの妻ヨハンナ、スザンナ、 その他多くの女たちも一緒であった。彼女たちは自分の財産を持って彼らに仕えていた。さて、
Hold on a second while I make that go away so it doesn't make noise.
あなた方には神の国の奥義を知ることが許されていますが。
Hush. So that passage that I played a moment ago, it talked about Jesus' followers, many of whom were women, and it said they supported him using their money. Jesus didn't have any money at all. And in what the Bible teaches about Jesus' story, women who had their own wealth, they contributed to his ministry and in part made it possible. Now, is that why so many Christian nations are higher up on the World Economic Forum gender gap list? No, I don't think that's cause and effect. But is there, coming out of the Bible, a particular inclusion of women in ways where they're powerful? Yes, I can find that everywhere. Are there also lots of moments, lots of situations where Christians have pushed women down and treated them unjustly? Yes, a whole lot. Is that a proper understanding of what the Bible teaches, or is it a perversion of it? That's a longer conversation. But that is what I found in fielding that question. All right. Yeah, I'll do about one or two more and then go on to today. Are there any changes between American married couples and Japanese married couples according to the data of satisfaction? A 2022 survey by Monmouth University says 9 out of 10 Americans in a relationship are satisfied, and 6 out of 10 report they are very satisfied. And a Pew Research report from 2019 says married couples are more satisfied than unmarried partners who have moved in together. For Japan, recent data on the satisfaction of married couples is a lot harder to get. I spent over an hour on it, and the best I could find was 20 years old. It said satisfaction was low, and companion behaviors, like sleeping in the same bed or making a point to talk daily, multiple times a week, those were very low. More recent data, as recent as September 2022, records that high percentages of Japanese young adults, I believe it was 17% of young men and 15% of young women, said they will never get married. Now, that is not data on the couples themselves, but it does say something about what they foresee would happen if they got married. That's the best I can do. Does the table of traditionalists and egalitarians in women and men change depending on whether the couple has children or not? I reread the study very carefully to see if there was an aside anywhere mentioning children. There's not. But the egalitarian women, they reported their frustration was over the division of work in the home. And I am confident asserting that a home with children has a lot more work in it than a home with no children. So that's my answer to that. Last one that I have time for. Nowadays, having children is considered a luxury, and the merits of getting married are diminishing. What do Christians think about this? 2 things. First, marriage is not a duty. Marriage is a calling, and it's not for everybody. That was part of my answer to the first question. And second, Christianity teaches that living simply is actually a virtue to be cultivated. You might recall when we talked about independent and interdependent self-construal. People with an interdependent self-construal, the research shows it's more important that in their clothes, their possessions, the car that they drive, the title they have at work, it should be something that shows status to other people. That's less of a motivator in the United States. I'm not saying it's not, and I'm not saying Americans don't spend money on brands and do so foolishly. But Christianity teaches that you shouldn't, that you should be satisfied with things that are simple. All right, let us move on to today's new subject. Kurt Hofstede, we have turned to what he said a few times before. He's the one who coined the idea of individualist and collectivist cultures. He is also the one who introduced the idea of direct and indirect culture, which had relevance last week, because marriage in a direct culture where you say things outright looks very different from marriage in a culture where you're expected to be indirect. Today, originally when I planned this class, I looked at this class meeting and I labeled it culture. And then I realized this whole class is about culture. I need a specific topic for today. And there was one that it's very important we introduce. Uncertainty avoidance. Uncertainty avoidance. Cultures can be high or low in uncertainty avoidance. Let me define it very simply, and then I'll give you details. In a high uncertainty avoidance culture, there is a proper way to do just about anything. And you'd better do it the proper way. In a low uncertainty avoidance culture, do things your own way. We don't much care. If you're happy, we're happy. And as you might guess, Japan is quite high uncertainty avoidance, one of the highest. The United States is moderately low uncertainty avoidance. Japan and the United States are very far apart in that one. The lowest uncertainty avoidance culture in the world by the data is Jamaica. In Jamaica, whatever you do it your way. We do not keep track of whether you did it right or not. But in higher uncertainty avoidance cultures, everyone knows the proper way to do just about everything. Here are some of the items from the questionnaires Kurt Hofstede used to measure uncertainty avoidance. I feel anxious when the future seems unpredictable. It makes me uncomfortable when someone provides unclear directions. Managers should provide workers with detailed directions and expectations. And this is probably the one that's been studied the most, I prefer to manage my money with a highly structured budget and plan. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, every time you have money come in, you know by plan where every yen is going to go. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, you spend money as much as you need to when you see an opportunity. Budgets? Who keeps a budget? A few things you would notice if you were to visit a low uncertainty avoidance culture. There's a lot less reliance on experts and on institutions. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, trust of institutions tends to be low. That's very true in the United States today. We struggled a lot with our response to COVID because so many Americans refused to wear a mask or take the vaccine because they said that doctors were making it up. They said there's no such thing as COVID. You're just telling us this lie to control us. Something else you would observe, this is my favorite illustration. You've seen it before in this room. I've talked about it explicitly. I've invited you a few times. I've said, does anyone have any questions? And I think I've told you, when I teach in the United States, typically I'll start a lecture like this. I'll get maybe 3 sentences into it, and someone will speak up with a question. And sometimes I answer the question, and sometimes someone over here answers it instead, and we get a discussion going. And so many American professors come to Japan thinking, I will ask, who has questions? Someone will raise their hand, and we'll have a conversation. Because that's what happens in American college classes. Not here. Now, nobody is saying you're not good students. I think you're better students, honestly, than my students back home. This is high uncertainty avoidance. They will speak up during class and say whatever pops into their head because they were raised in a low uncertainty avoidance culture. When I was looking through published research on the difference between Japan and the United States on the dimension of uncertainty avoidance, I came across a case study. Let me quickly tell you about this case study. There was an American who lived over here for a very long time, worked in a large corporation, had a proposal that he had been assigned to develop and lead. So he did it the Japanese way. He did all his research, and then he went around to every single person who needed to approve it, and he did his nemawashi. He had the meeting before the meeting with everybody. Then they scheduled the public meeting to approve his plan. But the morning of that meeting, he got news that the government had changed a regulation. So he changed one detail in the plan, came to the meeting, and said, everybody, the plan I discussed with all of you is here in front of you. By the way, I changed this one detail because of this government regulation, but everything else is the same. Are we ready to approve it? Everybody in the room stayed dead silent. Wouldn't say a word. They had to cancel the meeting. And what he learned from that was, when he had to make the tiny change, he should have postponed the meeting, gone back around to everybody, shown them the change, and then scheduled the meeting. But when he said, I've changed something, he introduced uncertainty. And that is the difference we're talking about. For some cultures, they're very comfortable with moderate to high uncertainty. And for others, knowing exactly what's going to happen is very, very important. All right. Let me make sure I have not missed. Oh, 2 other things I should mention detail-wise. In lower uncertainty avoidance cultures, being on time is less important. Being late is kind of okay. Meetings and other events, they don't have to start or end on time necessarily. It's a lower priority. It also is more likely to be the case in a low uncertainty avoidance culture for you to quit your job and find a new one, maybe several times. The students of mine, my former students who graduate college, very commonly, in their first 2 to 3 years after college, they'll change jobs 7, 8, 9, 10 times. They keep finding a better fit, and they keep moving. And there's nothing unusual or bad about that. All right. Oh, and I almost forgot a study that I just found last night and wanted to share. It was a student's master's thesis, so it wasn't peer-reviewed, it wasn't published, But it was a very reputable university, and I was impressed. It had to do with dating behavior, uncertainty, avoidance, and what you do when you date. Japanese participants in the study reported they took a much longer period of time to get serious in a relationship. But they also treated the first one-on-one date, the first time just you and the other person went on a date together, that was a sign that the relationship was becoming serious. For Americans, the standard, and it's been the standard since I was in college, the first 2 dates are just about having fun. And you can have a first date and never see them again. Have a second date, never call them, never see them. The third date is the magic one. By the third date, you and that person need to have a talk, and you say, are we dating or are we not dating? For Japanese participants, the first one-on-one exclusive date was the moment things had started to get serious. All right. So what are the influences, the Christian influences, that are part of the reason that there is this difference? There's a picture still on here that has no relevance. I meant to edit it off. If you were to be around Christians, sooner or later, you would hear them talk about, you would hear someone say, one say to another, don't be legalistic. Don't tell me what the rules are. Don't tell me the specific behavior I have to follow to be a good Christian. Christians are always telling each other, you shouldn't be legalistic. We have Christian freedom. That, I think, is the influence in the culture that pushes the United States in particular and the West in general down in uncertainty avoidance. Let me explain, or try to explain, where it came from. In the first place, Jesus was Jewish. There's just no doubt about that. Jesus lived outside, he was born and grew up a couple of days' walk from Jerusalem. He spent the last days of his life in Jerusalem. He was Jewish. Now, if you go back to the history of the Jewish people, Moses, the man who led the Jewish people at the founding of the nation of Israel, Moses was given the law. God gave Moses the law. And God said, tell the people of Israel to obey this law. And they were serious about it. They wanted to obey the law. So they did what they called building a fence around the law. They took the law and they said more about it. They added details to it. One of the 10 Commandments says, remember the Sabbath day, the seventh day, and don't do any work on it. The command was very simple. 1 day out of every 7, rest from working. Stop working. Treat that as holy. God wants you to rest, not to work every day. But the religious leaders then began to define everything that could be called work. Picking things up and carrying them was work, if you walked more than a couple hundred meters. Building a fire was work, so building a fire was not allowed on the Sabbath. And the lists got longer and longer and more detailed until there were all kinds of things you were not allowed to do. And as for the other commands in the law, the teachers added details to those to tell you how you were supposed to do them. There are teachings in the Bible about keeping clean. When the teachers added all the details, it became, you must wash your hands when you sit down to a meal. Now that sounds okay, that's a good idea, but it kept growing until it became, during the meal, you should wash your right hand 3 separate times and each time say a prayer, and wash your left hand 3 separate times, and each time say a prayer, and you do that every time you eat the meal. Now their motive was, God said, keep clean. We want to obey God. We want to really obey God. Jesus came on the scene, and Jesus said, this is not what God commanded you, and it is not what he wants. And it was when he confronted the religious teachers on that issue that they decided he was an enemy. And they were the ones who ultimately turned him over to be put to death. Today, people who are still practicing Jews continue to practice the law as the teachers added in the details. And if you talk to people who are practicing Jews, they'll happily explain it to you. The details are called the Talmud. The Talmud is the commentary on the law written by the rabbis. Let me give you one example. In the Bible, it says, do not take a calf and boil it alive in its mother's milk. And it has that command 3 separate times. Now the rabbis saw that command was repeated, and they said, that one's important to God, that's why it's repeated. They therefore said, what God really means is, don't eat meat and anything dairy at the same meal, ever. And if you know any Jewish people who keep kosher, that's a major part of it. Meat and dairy cannot be eaten at the same meal. Cheeseburgers are never kosher. It goes further. People who keep kosher, very observant, ultra-Orthodox Jewish people, will often have 2 different sets of pots and pans in their kitchen, color-coded. And if a dish has any dairy in it, you make it with the red pans. And if it has meat in it, you make them with the blue pans. And if you make a mistake and put dairy in the wrong pan, you have to throw it away and buy a new one. That came from the teaching originally that you're not to boil a calf alive in its mother's milk. That is the pattern that it followed. They also, often they'll keep different scrubbing pads so they can scrub the different dishes with different scrubbing pads so no dairy crosses over and gets on the pans that you use for meat. And I'll give you one more detail that I came across. I do not believe in making fun of people's sincerely held religious beliefs. This is not to make fun. But this is an observant Jewish and ultra-Orthodox observant Jewish person traveling on an airplane. This picture was circulated, and people said that it was because women were allowed on the plane. And his rabbi told him you could only be ceremonially clean if you wore plastic for the entire flight. As it turns out, that was not right. The real explanation puzzled me even more. The rabbi told him he needed to wear plastic because the plane might fly over cemeteries where dead bodies are buried. And if it did, he would become ceremonially unclean. Now I'm giving you these examples to make the case. Judaism, the people group that Jesus was born into, they are a very high uncertainty avoidance culture. There is a right way and a wrong way to do everything. And what Jesus did, one of the most essential things Jesus did, is he confronted that. And he said, that is not what you should be doing. I have 2 passages from Jesus to share very briefly. There we are, and let's see.
第7章
さて、パリサイ人たちとエルサレムから来た何人かの律法学者たちがイエスのもとに集まった。彼らはイエスの弟子のうちのある者たちが汚れた手で、すなわち洗っていない手でパンを食べているのを見た。パリサイ人をはじめユダヤ人は皆、昔の人たちの言い伝えを固く守って、手をよく洗わずに食事をすることはなく、市場から戻った時は体を清めてからでないと食べることをしなかった。他にも杯、水差し、銅器や信頼を洗い清めることなど、受け継いで固く守っていることがたくさんあったのである。パリサイ人たちと律法学者たちはイエスに尋ね
た。なぜあなたの弟子たちは昔の人たちの言い伝えによって歩まず、汚れた手でパンを食べるのですか？
イエスは彼らに言われた。
イザヤはあなた方偽善者について見事に予言し、こう書いています。この民は口先で私を敬うが、その心は私から遠く離れている。彼らが私を礼拝しても虚しい。人間の命令を教えとして教えるのだから。あなた方は神の戒めを捨てて、人間の言い伝えを固く守っているのです。
And I want to real quick jump down to where this encounter ended.
イエスは再び群衆を呼び寄せて言われた。
皆、私の言うことを聞いて悟りなさい。外から入って人を汚すことのできるものは何もありません。人の中から出てくるものが人を汚すのです。
イエスが群衆を離れて家に入られると、弟子たちはこの例えについて尋ねた。イエスは彼らに言われた。
あなた方までそんなにも物分かりが悪いのですか？わからないのですか？外から人に入ってくるどんなものも人を汚すことはできません。それは人の心には入らず、腹に入り排泄されます。
こうしてイエスはすべての食物を清いとされた。
So if you know anyone today who is an observant Jewish person, you probably, if they're observant and practicing, the odds are pretty good they keep kosher. Right there, Jesus said keeping kosher is not required. That is how squarely he confronted the way the law had been built up by adding details. That's one of the more sweeping changes Jesus brought to the religion that people had when he first came in contact with them. And so, when Christians talk to one another about don't be legalistic, we have freedom. I have, pretty quickly, one more passage I want to share with you. This is not Jesus talking. Earlier today, I mentioned Paul, the follower of Jesus who wrote large parts of what appears in the Bible. This is from a letter Paul wrote to a church, and it has to do with why God gave the law in the first place. If Jesus was going to say that the law was not meant to be as binding on people. So, here is what Paul had to say about the purpose of the law, and then we will draw some conclusions.
律法の行いによる人々は皆呪いのもとにあります。律法の書に書いてあるすべてのことを守り行わない者は皆呪われると書いてあるからです。律法によって神の前に義と認められる者が誰もいないということは明らかです。義人は信仰によって生きるからです。律法は信仰によるのではありません。律法の掟を行う人はその掟によって生きるのです。キリストはご自分が私たちのために呪われたものとなることで 私たちを律法の呪いからあがない出してくださいました。木にかけられた者は皆呪われていると書いてあるからです。それはアブラハムへの祝福がキリストイエスによって異邦人に及び、私たちが信仰によって約束の御霊を受けるようになるためでした。
And again, I'm going to jump down, play one more passage, and then we're done for the time being with the Bible.
信仰が現れる前、私たちは律法の下で監視され、来たるべき信仰が掲示されるまで閉じ込められていました。こうして律法は私たちをキリストに導く養育係となりました。それは私たちが信仰によって義と認められるためです。しかし信仰が現れたので、私たちはもはや養育係のもとにはいません。あなた方は皆信仰によりキリストイエスにあって神の子供です。キリストにつくバプテスマを受けたあなた方は皆キリストを着たのです。ユダヤ人もギリシャ人もなく、奴隷も自由人もなく、男と女もありません。あなた方は皆キリストイエスにあって一つだからです。あなた方がキリストのものであれば、アブラハムの子孫であり、約束による相続人なのです。
So, you've heard me say before that Christianity is a relationship. It is a parent, daughter, son relationship, and it's about all of us being invited to be God's daughters and sons. And I want you to think for a minute, this relationship with the law, God giving the law, and then Jesus coming along and saying the law is not meant to be this binding. The way it's often taught is when you have very young children, you give them rules, and you want them to follow the rules. But what you hope is by the time your children become adults, you want them to learn your values. You want them to develop character to where they'll choose on their own to do things that honor you, even when you are no longer enforcing your rules on them. Rules produce what we in the social sciences call compliance. They don't produce a change in the heart. If you do something only because a rule tells you you have to, that's not persuasion. It doesn't change what you want to do. But if you love someone perfectly and you see that behaving a certain way might bring them joy, then you might choose to behave that way, want to, do it even if nobody's watching. And that is where God wants people to wind up. He wants people to choose freely to do what He's taught is the right way to live. And maybe even a better fit for our discussion of high versus low uncertainty avoidance cultures, the people Jesus spoke to, what they had learned was a culture. The people around them had made up the rules. And He said, when you're just following rules that the people around you made up, that's not God's will for you. You ought to grow in love and wisdom until the choices you make in the moment, based on the situation you see, are the right choices. That, I think, is the influence that in part explains why the United States and a lot of other Western nations are lower in uncertainty avoidance than Japan is. All right. I think we may get out of class a little early today because that got me to the end of talking about the day's new content. Let me put, for one thing, I forgot to take our break where you go and sit with your partner. And I'm not sure this is current. Oh yeah, I think it is current. So, if you have not already sat with your partner in the spot that corresponds to the row that you're on in this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is linked in Classroom. You can get to it on your own device. Please move to the spot that matches your row.